I'm Michael Quinn Patton, coming to you from Minnesota in the north central part of the United States. I am a professional evaluator and have been for nearly 50 years, part of creating the field of evaluation, which now we estimate has some 50,000 professional evaluators around the world, people who look at programs, various kinds, private sector, government programs, nonprofit programs, non-governmental organizations of all kinds to help determine if they are effective. Over these past 5 decades, evaluation has become a very diverse field with lots of different models and approaches, different purposes, from accountability to program improvement to making major judgments about effectiveness to working on taking programs to scale, that is, taking them from one place to other places in the world. I'm going to be talking about one particular kind of evaluation that has emerged in the last decade, developmental evaluation, which is aimed at helping programs adapt in complex dynamic systems. The year 2015 was designated by the United Nations the International Year of Evaluation. That was the year in which we transitioned from the Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015 and began the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which are targets from 2015 to 2030. And we are a third of the way through that period now, and none of the countries are meeting those targets. Climate change targets are not being met. And part of that is because of the dynamics in the world itself. What evaluators try to do and work in support of is bringing evidence to bear in the face of change conditions. Developmental evaluation in particular is aimed at helping people pivot, that is, to adapt to changing conditions and to make evidence the core of that adaptation. We are at a time where we have been experiencing through the global pandemic the tensions between political decision-making and science-driven decision-making, popular public appeasing and work by evaluators and scientists to try to do what the evidence suggests. This tension is widespread as we attempt to figure out what to do with major kind of global issues like the pandemic, like climate change and the climate emergency, like the social justice uprising. And I'm coming to you at a time when we are still in the throes of those global events. Peter Drucker, the great management consultant, once said, "The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic." And so what I'm going to talk with you about is a different kind of evaluation logic to be applied in complex dynamic situations and where we are experiencing local and global turbulence. Developmental evaluation applies complexity concepts to enhance innovation and use. And that means it is prepared to help people look at change conditions, new knowledge, change challenges, and adapt to those change challenges. Evaluation in that way joins futurists in trying to support the future. Futurists do scenarios about the future to help us think about how the world might be different. Evaluators are essentially historians capturing what has already gone on, but the reason evaluators do that is study the past and the present to inform the future, and though in that way we are also aiming at supporting future directions. Recommendations about how to engage with the future make evaluators both historians and futurists. And so historically, we know that we are in a time of ongoing turbulence, of a new normal, what is sometimes called post-normal, and that the approaches to planning and project implementation, organizational management of the past, that past logic, assumed a fairly stable world where you could do 3-year and 5-year plans and plan your work and work your plan. We don't live in that world anymore. We live in a place of great dynamism with things changing rapidly. And so we need evaluation approaches for a post-normal world that is a post-normal evaluation. So for example, at the time as I'm speaking, we are already trying to extract lessons from the coronavirus for the global emergency. And there are speculations around the futuring of a doomsday scenarios that we have just 10 years to 2030, a point of no return on climate change. On the other hand, there are people who are saying new technology, new ways of working, increasing knowledge about these problems give us hope that humanity will address these kind of problems. So there's good news and there's bad news. There's pessimism, there's optimism. And what evaluators do is help weigh that evidence, help support dialogue about the different kinds of evidence, the different perspectives, to help policymakers, the general public, decision makers, program directors, people engaged in change to assess what the pathways are forward for a just and sustainable future. The work that I'm sharing with you comes from a perspective called utilization-focused evaluation, which makes the use of evaluation for decision-making and program improvement and adaptation its primary concern. It's not a pure research approach. It's not based upon trying to create a new knowledge in the traditions of disciplines. It's more action-oriented. It's recognizing that what we learn in real time informs our future, but that we never know perfectly how things are going to turn out, and the evidence is never absolute. So what we've increasingly turned to is what we call evaluative thinking, being able to weigh evidence, being able to think about the pros and cons of evidence. You don't get absolute answers in most cases. What we get, as again epitomized by responses to the global pandemic, is different countries taking different approaches because they face different situations, have different health systems, have different political systems, have different cultural systems. And so you can't have one size fits all that works everywhere in the world on anything. What we've done in the past with logic models, with SMART goals that have been dominant in evaluation, is try to come up with what were called best practice models that could be taken to scale around the world. Now we are much more in a world where there aren't models that can be generalized everywhere, but that what we have to do is ongoing learning within a context about what works for whom, in what ways, under what conditions in that context. That means that the question in evaluation has changed from the overall summing up question of effectiveness. Does the program work? Is it effective? Which is a yes-no formulation of the question, to this more nuanced, adaptable question: what works where, for whom, under what conditions, with what consequences, in what context? That's a learning, an adaptation framing of the question. In the past, evaluation was dominated by thinking about models, about projects, and trying to improve those models and projects and decide overall if they worked. And that goes back to the last 5 decades when evaluation began. But complexity and complex dynamic systems really questions the generalizability and replicability of models because of the vast differences in the world. Complex situations, then, are ones in which, as we begin to work a plan, we learn things, we find that some things are applicable, some things aren't, the world changes, new possibilities emerge, the conditions that we expected to be there aren't there, new partnerships arise, resources change, and so instead of simply pursuing a plan without regard to what's going on, ongoing learning, developmental learning in the course of change conditions leads us to examine forks in the road, decisions along the way, and each of those small decisions that get made about should we do more of this or less of this, should we go this way or that way, end up accumulating to become major different kinds of interventions. And that is what developmental evaluation focus on. We say that evaluation grew up in the projects with a project mentality. In the United States, it came out of the Great Society War on Poverty programs and projects. And so over the last 50 years, we've gotten very good at evaluating projects and programs, goal attainment, implementation evaluation, generating conclusions, lessons, recommendations. But now evaluators are joining in evaluating organizational mission fulfillment, strategy, innovation, advocacy, policy change, systems change, complex dynamic interventions, community impacts, regional initiatives, networks and collaborations, leadership effectiveness, inclusiveness and diversity, collective impact, scaling, environmental ecosystem sustainability, and global systems transformation. None of those things are projects or programs. They are systems change about making a difference in the world in complex ways. And so evaluation needs to adapt itself. Evaluation needs to be transformed in order to transform the world, in order to support transforming the innovations under complex conditions. And that's what developmental evaluation aims to do. It is an approach to helping innovation and adaptation by asking evaluative questions, bringing evaluative logic and thinking, gathering and reporting ongoing data to support organizational and innovation development with timely feedback. As I said, our current situation in the world illustrates the importance of that. The COVID-19 as a global situation, the early chart that showed the flattening the curve efforts, the way that that's played out in the different countries and different communities has led to a great deal of learning. And that learning goes on as the ways in which different countries and communities respond gives rise to new interventions and new decisions, which are quite varied. Epidemiologists are engaged in ongoing evaluation and adaptation, often supported by evaluative data. There was a cartoon in The Economist magazine that showed the coronavirus and the world in a boxing match. And standing outside the ring, looming over that boxing match, was climate change as the next big battle. Indeed, there are epidemiologists and specialists in health medicine, futurists, who are saying that the global pandemic, the coronavirus, is not really the big one, that there are bigger, more virulent viruses yet to come. And the intersection with the climate emergency, with the Black Lives Matter social justice uprising, with changes and stresses in global finance, the global economy going through ups and downs, partly stimulated by the effects on the economy of the pandemic, affecting financial markets and employment. And the doomsday clock, the Union of Scientists keeps a doomsday clock about how close we are to midnight. And last year they moved it 10 seconds closer, having us now something like 90 seconds before midnight because of the renewed nuclear threat that has emerged in the world. And in the midst of all of this, joining the pandemic is what's being called an infodemic. Infodemia is the preponderance of misinformation that's out there on the internet, fake news, alternative facts, groupthink, distortions, post-truth. Against that are evaluators and scientists who are trying to emphasize facts, evidence, truth, data, reality, and scientific and evaluative thinking. And we're in a tug of war of these opposing forces about how to make sense of reality. What developmental evaluation brings to that is an ongoing engagement with people bringing about change to use evidence to support and counter infodemia. We did some research with social innovators and change agents about their perceptions of evaluation. We used a technique called photo voice, in which we show a variety of photographs to people as an interview technique and ask them to pick the photograph that best represents their experience of the thing we're interviewing about. In this case, interviewing social innovators, people bringing about major change, interviewing them about their perceptions of evaluation. So they're looking at a rainbow, they're looking at a forest fire, they're looking at a meeting in an office tower, they're looking at roadkill on the road, they're looking at a family vacation, they're looking at a superhighway, and out of 20 photographs, they pick the one that most represents for them their experience of evaluation. Overwhelmingly, the photograph that they most often picked showed a man on a bicycle filled in the back with big boxes, overwhelming the bicycle, carrying this heavy load that you can see he's barely able to balance. It's baggage, it's excess baggage. It makes it hard to move and to navigate. That's been the experience of evaluation. So developmental evaluation set out to make evaluation more useful for social innovation. The complaint social innovators had about traditional evaluation is that it's a lot of paperwork, it slows them down, it's a bunch of forms, it's compliance activity, it's just focused on accountability. Did you do what you were given money for? Did you plan your work and work your plan? And in fact, traditional accountability-oriented forms of evaluation inhibit innovation because the contracts specify exactly what you're supposed to do for 3 years and make it difficult to change that as you're learning and adapting. Developmental evaluation then assumes that there are going to be changes. And there are 5 different kinds of developmental evaluation that have emerged. The first of those is ongoing development, where as programs are conducted in areas where a model doesn't make sense, there's no intention of trying to get to a model, you're making ongoing adaptations. Leadership training in a dynamic world can't have a fixed curriculum. Peace and conflict management programs can't have predetermined outcomes. Depends on who comes to the table and what gets negotiated. Community innovation, community development that engages community people in setting their own goals and working on their own priorities, things that matter to them, can't have a predetermined model because it depends on the community and their engagement and building their capacity. And so in these areas where people are emerging to work on innovation, they need an approach that allows for ongoing development. And developmental evaluation accompanies that developmental journey. A second form of developmental evaluation is helping generate innovations. So traditionally, evaluation comes into play once an innovation or a program or project begins operating, and the evaluation helps determine whether goals are being met, whether the model is being faithfully followed, what is called fidelity evaluation. But where do those programs come from? How are those projects developed? Developmental evaluation involves evaluators participating in the design process, in the process of creating innovations. So evaluation is no longer simply a back-end activity. It's no longer something that just happens at the end to ask the question, did you achieve your goals and did the program work? Developmental evaluation joins with designers, with people doing needs assessment, situation analysis, figuring out what to do to bring evaluative thinking into the design process itself. A pre-project, pre-formative approach to developmental evaluation, very much on the front end of action, where there are dynamic situations and joining forces with social innovators, social entrepreneurs, advocates of change to help them use evaluative thinking to be more effective. An example of this is a program that emerged in New Zealand among the Maori people, where they wanted to create a new approach to health and recreation based upon Maori culture. The Maori are about 20% of the New Zealand population. Maori is an official language in New Zealand, but historically, the government had done things to the Maori, and then in the last 20 years, as politics changed, they began doing projects with the Maori. But this new initiative, the Maori group wanted to engage in health and recreation as Maori, to develop an approach that was Maori culture based. And so the evaluators in New Zealand worked with the program to develop principles and practices of health and recreation as Maori. The evaluators were a part of that development as they engaged and tracked with what different communities did, with what different groups did, helped capture those developments, help share them across communities, help extract lessons from them. And in doing that, they were able to work together to improve and develop new approaches to health and recreation based upon Maori culture, moving from having things done to the Maori, with the Maori, for the Maori, to being done by the Maori and as Maori. That's an innovative approach that would have been stifled by traditional evaluation that required goal specification and detailed implementation ahead of time. This was all emergent as they experienced that vision of what they wanted to do. And the evaluators worked with them to help operationalize that vision. A third approach to developmental evaluation is systems change itself, where we've moved from projects and programs to taking on systems. A part of what has happened with the social justice uprising following the murder of George Floyd right here in Minnesota, where I'm coming to you from. The emergent understanding that you don't combat ongoing long-term racism and inequalities simply by passing laws, by trying to change the rules of the game, by making new policies. What's emerged is concern about systemic racism, structural racism, institutional racism, institutional inequities, structural inequities. And that moves us then from doing projects and programs in silos to taking on changing systems. That's a different kind of animal. It's a different kind of task. And developmental evaluation is aimed at helping people think in systems terms, to think in terms of interrelationships, perspectives, boundaries, dynamics, emergence, nonlinearities, the things that go on in complex dynamic systems that require a different form of evaluation. A fourth approach is to take what is learned in these different efforts at the level of principles and help adapt principles to new sites. So under a traditional form of evaluation, a model gets developed and that model gets spread around the world to be implemented exactly as it was designed and evaluated. But developmental evaluation, in contrast, identifies principles that can be spread and shared, but have to be adapted. They're not rigid recipes. They provide direction, insight, and knowledge, but they are at the level of principle rather than at the level of detailed practice. An example of the difference is that a stop sign, when you're driving, is a rule. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. A set of principles is engaged in defensive driving. Defensive driving says pay attention. Don't drive distracted. Adjust your driving for traffic, for weather, for other drivers. Be mindful. Those are directions. They are principles, but you have to think about them and make sense of them within your own driving context. That's what innovation principles are, and developmental evaluators help generate those principles rather than rigid recipes. And finally, there is developmental evaluation used in rapid response humanitarian crises, where in tsunamis, in volcanoes, in civil wars, in refugee camps, where things are changing rapidly on the ground, planning, execution, design, implementation, and evaluation all have to happen simultaneously. Rapid response, quickly. And developmental evaluation becomes a part of that team effort to keep track of what's happening in real time under emergency and crisis conditions. Two economists, Roth and Shapley, won the 2012 Nobel Economics Prize for what they called matching theory. Matching theory is about how doctors are connected with hospitals, how students are connected with schools, how kidneys are connected with transplant recipients, how people are connected in marriage. And the challenge in any arena these days is matching what approach you're taking to the situation. And that means, in this case, matching the evaluation approach to the evaluation situation. Basically, I've been suggesting that the situation in which evaluation occurs has changed from the more stable world of projects and programs to the dynamic world of social innovation and systems change. Recognizing that situation and understanding that there are a lot of choices about how to go about evaluation, developmental evaluation is one of those choices. And I invite you to consider and think about whether that fits in the kind of evaluation challenges you face. Thank you very much.